Here we are.
Good day, Nicholas, and thank you very much for joining us to talk to the Mint today.
Hi, Henry. Evening here and morning there.
Indeed. The light's just coming up. I'm beginning to see the snow on the trees outside.
Oh,
it's beautiful weather around here. Very, very cold. So today we were going to talk about what might be largely called poverty alleviation programs, or action by government to try and address the impacts of poverty and dysfunction and so on. And so I wanted to start by asking you how you got interested in these programs, what it was that sparked your involvement.
In 2009, I was chairing a government inquiry into the internet and government. So social media was coming along, and one of the people on that inquiry was also involved in an organisation called the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, which is a bit of a fancy name, really. In some ways, I think it would be better if it thought of itself in more traditional terms. The British have this term charity that we don't tend to use so much, but it's an ancient word, goes back at least to the King James Bible, and it's quite a good word. And so this was an organisation quite influenced by some British writing by people like Jeff Mulgan from Nesta. And it was looking at this thing it called social innovation, which is to try to reconfigure certain kinds of relationships which have not worked out and which are producing bad results. And a good example of this was this is now 12 years ago, and they were bringing the idea of co-design, which is now quite a lot more common, but it was a pretty new idea in those days, which is a shocking thought, but it's true. And they were bringing this idea of co-design, and the person one of the staff of this organization had been working in child protection. Now, child protection, don't think of the Catholic Church and sexual abuse. Think of families having to have their kids taken off them because their families are so abusive and neglectful to those children. Yeah. And around the world, it'd be interesting, I don't know this, but it'd be interesting to know how different the relative performance of different countries here. But I think it's a pretty reasonable generalized statement that around the world, you take the child out of a disastrous situation and you place them in a only mildly less disastrous situation. The results of this process are almost invariably awful. There are obviously some success stories, but as a class of activity, how's this for a statistic? That half of the children that are taken off their parents are taken off parents who were taken off their parents.
Yes.
So, this is a terrible story. And Lem Sisse, the Chancellor of Manchester University, I think, is a guy who was taken off his parents and put into this foster care system and has survived, but also speaks to the the immense psychological damage that it's done. And so so this group built an alternative to taking kids, built a early intervention program, which was called Family by Family. And what they did is it's quite instructive to go through what they built, because they spent quite a lot of time with families, talking to them, asking them what they thought of, what they thought would work, why families fell into crisis and so on. And they eventually designed this process where local families would basically recruit families to set up in supermarkets and so on. And they recruited families into two groups. One, a group that identified themselves as at risk of some kind of, and there are quite a few families with young kids who feel that, I think. And then families who were in the local area who would like to mentor such families. And it would be a good thing if those families had been through tough times themselves. Right. Now, in addition to this, that everyone says, oh, how lovely, because I call this the Rousseau, the Jean-Jacques Rousseau move, that really civilization's the problem. People are terribly lovely and we just need them to have a chat and get on with each other and stay away from the bureaucrats and the experts. But I think this was much more intelligent process, because this mentoring process was then paid with an honorarium and coached by a trained family coach. And
Right.
it was immense. Now, these families have got a hell of a lot of work to do. They're in a very difficult situation. Their habits of mind aren't very, have got all kinds of issues. There's often some domestic violence. There's usually these, we call them families that were mostly single mothers under a fair bit of stress. And so I saw this process built, and I was very enthusiastic about this. And I also thought that we were a sort of that me and this organization were a kind of marriage made in heaven, in this sense that I could certainly see how they illustrate how what they were doing showed up so powerfully what was missing from my own training and all my instincts as someone who deals with in government policy. But it was also very important for somebody to think about how policy itself could pick this up. And by that I mean, and by pick it up, I don't mean fund it and have some pilots, because that's everyone does that. That's going on all the time. I mean, build a mechanism in which, if this process starts to perform much better than what we're doing, that it starts to expand and be funded, and the other stuff, the legacy stuff, starts to get defunded. Now,
Right.
that simply doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in this country, and I dare say it doesn't happen in your country. It's incredibly difficult to get that to happen, even with the best will in the world. And I'm afraid I would never accuse our bureaucrats of having the best will in the world. They have quite a lot of goodwill, but they certainly don't have the best will in the world. Even if you were trying, this would be a really hard thing to do for reasons we can talk about. But we're not really trying. Everyone's going through the motions, filling in the forms, protecting their minister from embarrassment, appearing in prime minister's questions, and it's sort of in a thousand subtle ways. It's basically impossible to have this new method displace the old one. You can have it on the outskirts, you can have it, doing lots of nice things, but I've never. Here's a challenge for your audience: if they can email me with an example, even something quite small, where something was done one way, somebody showed that you could do it better and grew a system that did it better and got rid of the old system. You tell me about it, because we've been talking about doing this for a generation or more.
So what happened with this specific example? How did that turn out?
Well, it's still going in. So it made its way to 2 states of Australia. It was in, I think, 2, possibly 4 suburbs in Adelaide. It's still functioning in some suburbs in Adelaide. It was funded and then defunded in New South Wales. But it never, after 5 years, my attitude was, well, you either grow this thing or you close it down. But nobody wanted to do either of those things. So it sort of settles in, and people fund it, and then all the poor mugs who are in it, the poor underpaid mugs and difficult, families in difficulty who are now beneficiaries of this system, they all go to the government, either cap in hand or run a bit of a political campaign to try and hang on to their money. We see these campaigns all the time. We don't know how are you going to tell their lobbying from the lobbying of people who are running some program that doesn't work. You can't.
And did it work dramatically better?
Well, I think it did. If you read my long reflective piece on this, which you can put in show notes, I've sent it to you, the evaluation of it, what was kind of inconsequential. So, remarkably enough, the government department that paid several millions of dollars to run this program in New South Wales wouldn't hand over the data. Why wouldn't it hand over the data? Well, everyone was relatively well-intentioned. There were privacy issues, I presume. It wasn't top of mind for anyone. There was a university that got quite a lot of money from us to do the evaluation. The evaluation was completed. They got their money. and they tried to do it in a way that was obviously not going to work, which was they tried to compare different areas with and without the program. And the problem with that was there were only a few families in the area with this program, and it was just a waste of everyone's time. Now that's to be expected. That's roughly how this system works. Everyone's got their, the academics are trying to get a paper published. The department's running the legacy program and doing their best, and someone's overworked and someone is a bit lazy, just the usual things. And it was hopeless. I could talk quite a lot more. So that's the simplest answer. The more complex answer is that this program, if it worked, would have worked over a very broad range of outputs. It would have generated better educational outputs, better health outputs. But a particular department will only be asking a question like, has this program reduced the chances of having to remove the children? Now, yes. I can give you just straight out anecdotal evidence. It's in the video, and I'll send that too, which leaves you in very little doubt that it's extremely likely that that running this program would have saved that one part of government quite a lot of money. But, other fashions will arise and new entrepreneurs will come to the government saying, we've got this new system that we got from Holland and we want to run this. And so, you bumble along for a while. You're never in play. This is never taken seriously. I mean, this program is called Family by Family, and I developed a quite elaborate idea, which I called Family by Family as a platform. Now, Family by Family as a platform was the idea that with the coach, one of the things we noticed was that services that were already provided, like autism sort of examinations and advice and so on, the families never went to them and they didn't get diagnosed. But with the trained family coach and the mentor would say, because the mentor got some training as well, and the mentors would say, come along with me to the autism center and we'll get that checked out. And I can show you videos of single mothers with tears in their eyes saying, I've answered, now I can at least start working on what the problem is. I know what the problem is. Yeah. So the answer, so that was improving health. And that would have improved educational outcomes. And the idea was that you would build this program and you would start building modules onto it. So imagine if the family coach was liaising, and the mentoring family were liaising with the local school on remedial teaching, with the local health area network on autism or mental health, or what was it, stress, anxiety, bullying, whatever it might be. So if you've got a healthy system, those things ought to be the kinds of things that it's trying to do. Now, for reasons that I foreshadowed a minute ago, it's actually quite hard to think through how you would do that organizationally, but I can confidently say that no system I've ever seen has even ever tried to do that.
And why do you think the standard don't like this sort of approach, or what is it?
It's a good question. It's a very good question, and I've sort of asked you. I've asked you to ask it, so you have. So now I've got to put up or shut up. So think about it. So I'm the head of a department, or I'm a senior executive in the Department of Community and Family Services, and I run a 1,200 social workers in New South Wales who run this system of assessing families, looking at notifications, taking them off, making decisions, or going to court to get kids off their families when they have to, and so on.
Yeah.
Now, every now and again, one of these children in foster care dies.
Yeah.
And if they die in foster care, you've got to have a pretty good answer for the minister, because at question time, the minister will be asked a question about it. So you have a mature system. It doesn't work in helping kids very much, doesn't work very much at all, but it's built out. it's battle tested. It's got a logic that can be explained to the community. It's got a logic that the Murdoch press won't send up, particularly because of the Murdoch. Imagine if somebody dies and a mentor family is involved. Well, you're just easy pickings. The journalist is not, if they want to turn this into a story, they're not going to go and say, oh, that's very interesting. There's been 500 children go through this system and we've had one death. What's the death rate in the other system? That's not how the laws of news work. No. So you're keeping your minister safe, and you might have a sign in the foyer saying, we put people first. But when you're keeping the minister safe, you're putting the minister first. Everything else is not interested. Not interested. If the minister needs a brief by 2 p.m. for question time, that is what I call the institutional imperative. Yeah. So what you've got is you've got some hard imperatives, and then you've got all this soft stuff. And now the other thing is, imagine if you were doing this and you decided to roll it out for 20% of the state. And then the social workers start getting redundancy notices because you're not using social workers, you're using trained family coaches. Yeah. Well, that's another series of TV programs and questions in Parliament and all the rest of it. And are we completely sure that this system is better than the legacy system? Well, no, not really, but we're pretty confident. Are we confident that we can get that across? Are we confident that we can get across the more sophisticated thinking in this? Well, look, really, and can you persuade the Treasurer and the Premier of New South Wales that when push comes to shove, they're not leaving themselves open to mortal political danger? It's hard, isn't it? And
I suppose fundamentally the people who are potentially being served, by definition, don't matter in a sense, in that they're the weakest, least powerful, so that the bigger risk is trying to do something about it than actually leave them to.
That's right. Suffer. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So, but I never like to. I mean, in a way, because it's slightly easier to explain the harder edges of this. I've explained the harder edges of this. There are lots of much more ambiguously soft edges where people just feel much more comfortable doing what they do. You've got this new set of routines. People get upset. People stuff things up. If you're running a big organization, just a few people who are really unhappy give you a lot of headaches. Yep. So you have to. So if you want this to happen, you've got to start building headaches. You've got to start building countervailing headaches. You've got to start building a few. So this is where some ideas of mine, like I call the evaluator general, come from, which is that someone is independently trying to measure the effectiveness of this new system at the same time, not just evaluate the new system, but say, compared to what?
Yes.
And compared to the legacy system. And then you start to generate the sweaty palms in government and in the organisation. Then somebody says that we've got the social workers union hopping into us, the public service unions hopping into it. They're on telly tonight, and then and the person says, what do I do to stop this? And then the answer comes back, well, or if you do stop it, you've still got this question to answer, which is your program looks like it's 3 times as cost effective as the thing that the social workers are running. Do you really want to defend the legacy system? So that's sort of the idea, that you're trying to build the political economy of change. And
so can I go back on that? Because just to be clear, so if you can have some sort of external body that is highlighting the inadequacies of the current system compared to the possibility of doing things differently, then you can bring pressure on the minister to effectively take seriously the alternatives.
Yeah, that's the idea. I think the other thing to do is to find a way to build institutions and this isn't something you can do quickly, but to build institutions which do empower the beneficiary community, and then you get them to say, would you rather more of this or more of that? But that isn't something that can be done in a consumer charter. It's something where it's a bit like building the agency and capability of those families with a coach. These are people who have got problems with with feeling their own agency in the world, and they need to develop that. So we have no political models like this. We have elections and we have juries, but there are very few there are very few representative groups that are chosen by juries, and there are representative groups that are chosen by membership organizations and elections, and they tend to choose activists with their own kinds of imperatives. Their imperatives often are refracted through media imperatives.
Yeah. Can we just go back to the challenge of setting up this independent, what you call an evaluator general? I mean, I suppose people might say, well, we have the audit, we have national audit offices and things like that.
Yeah.
And don't these institutions also have their own sort of, I mean, they can't be too problematic because then they get shut down if they're creating too much trouble and so on. So can't they also get bought into the system? Because ultimately ministers are still in charge and they don't want people giving them a hard time.
Exactly. And that's why I made the point that it's better if you steward this independence into the beneficiary community, because you're doing it for the beneficiaries. That's hard. And so, but as you point out quite correctly, building something in government that is genuinely independent rather than has an independent stamp on it is a very different, those are very different things. And the classic example, there are two good examples of this. One is an area called regulation review, where Australia led the world on this, but they didn't lead it anywhere in particular. And there's in 1986, I think America and Australia came up with these policies, which were in Australia, we called it minimum effective regulation. And the idea was that you didn't allow regulation through if you hadn't done a regulatory impact analysis that demonstrated that the benefits outweighed the cost. In principle, a perfectly good idea, but in practice, that's not how it worked. What happened was that it became an additional piece of bureaucracy, a piece of regulation that was regulating the regulators. And if a minister wanted to get something, the minister would get someone to write a regulatory impact statement, and the regulatory impact statement would compare. There were various attempts to codify what were in these statements, and one of the codifications here is that there have to be three options. Well, that's pretty easy to work out how you have three options, and the one you want is option B in the middle. Option A is we could shoot parking offenders. Well, that won't work. And option B is we could counsel them. Option C is we could counsel people who park overpark their stay. And option B is that we fine them £50. And so it's obvious that
you tick the boxes. Going back to the strategy of empowering beneficiaries, I mean, the interesting thing there isn't it, that what you're really addressing is the overall inequalities in society, aren't you? Because aren't you in a way saying that where you have a really unequal society, the people at the bottom will never get what they really need? There'll be a sort of performative approach to supporting them unless you actually address those fundamental inequalities and give the power moves more to them. They will never be really properly served.
I think that's completely true. The problem is that power consists of two things: money and then capacity to operate in the society on other people. And if you've got a university degree, judging by the proportion of people in Parliament who've got university degrees compared with the proportion of the community that have got university degrees, and the proportion of people in high-paying jobs and in banks and in wherever else you like, in senior positions in NGOs and charities, these people have all got university degrees. So these people are high agency people. And if you don't have as big as if you don't have as much education as that in Western societies, you're a low agency person. Now, there will be exceptions to that, highly charismatic people who are not well educated, but that's so. So you. So if you're trying to address the problem, it's all very well to say, yes, we're just addressing a symptom. That's true in a way, but you're addressing the symptom at source, and you're trying to say it's not just a matter of handing some money to you, which you can then spend on grog and cigarettes and so on. I think grog might be an Australian word that you guys don't have, but anyway, on alcohol and gambling and all the traps that our entrepreneurs have set up to harvest some money
Yes.
of bad habits. You're trying to find ways to unpick this. And, if you want to just make the world a whole lot more equal, best of luck in the next election. It's a case of you've got to move. I'm in favor of doing it, but there's not much point in giving people lectures about it. They'll vote against it beyond a certain point.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, isn't it? Because, I mean, I was interested to read the sort of, I suppose, the classic history of Sweden, where, you go back pre-1920s, incredibly unequal, extreme,
Right.
relative to the rest of Europe. Then
Interesting.
there's a sort of revolution of sorts or a change, and they build a social democratic country with incredible equality. And then from the 90s onwards, the levels of equality are heading back in the sort of opposite direction.
Yeah.
And one wonders, what is it, why do, obviously once, and I suppose you can say in the UK as well, the levels of inequality dropped in the, towards the 70s, and then the 80s, they started going up again. And how do you, it's like somehow the elite tell this story that, you could be us as well, drop, give up on everyone else and join our unequal society at the top.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it is very like that. And we have systems of power that are entangled in systems of knowledge, and those people who have got more training are in a position to advantage themselves. They also run the knowledge systems, and I guess you hope that if they're run well with some sort of sense of noblesse oblige, that's the best we've ever managed, really, is the sort of, I'm not saying this is utopian by any means, but I think the social contract that we had with professionals, say until the 1970s or 80s, which was you become a professional, you behave with integrity, if you're a surgeon, you don't pick up you don't pay referral fees to a doctor to send you people to operate on. You end up maybe you're paid a lot more money than your average person. You end up playing golf if that's what you want to do. You're highly respected, but you're not a billionaire. You're not massively wealthy. You're just a pillar of the community. Now, I'm not telling you that this is nirvana. I grew up in that world, and I thought there were lots of things wrong with it. Not that it's necessary to that world, but we all know about that world being more racist and sexist and a whole bunch of other things. There were plenty of things wrong with it. But it was a world which was much more culturally unified. And I remember going to the football when I was a kid, and I sort of felt like I was an Australian and I was with other Australians and we were all at football. And that you can't even get that feeling at football anymore. There are wealthy people's seats and the cheap seats. There is different ways of behaving. These are all somewhat less pronounced than in the UK. And the UK has superficially divested itself of quite a lot of the uglier sides of its class system. But, we just have a very, the educated versus the not so well educated classes. That's the great cleavage in our society. And what is extraordinary is that we have endless debate and action on this thing called diversity. But the one thing that gets left out of it is diversity of levels of education. That's not what anyone wants to know. They want highly legible issues to deal with: black, white, sexual orientation, all this kind of stuff. I'm not against those things, but we have the country's being the place is being torn apart. We've got Donald Trump, we've got Brexit, we've got the Murdoch press just making hay out of the resentment of people feeling that they're being ignored. Why do they feel they're being ignored? Because they are being ignored and vilified as racists and all this sort of stuff. It's a very, very toxic brew, and that's where we are now.
And any hope to end this on, in terms of, because we've been going there for some time, haven't we? Are there any ways out? You see any?
Well,
leading a way out?
Look, I feel that I think there are signs of, you've now got a government in the United Kingdom that isn't obviously incompetent and utterly disregarding of, even the most basic decencies or proprieties, I suppose. So that's a step forward for you. Donald Trump seems to be somewhat on the skids. I mean, the really exciting news came from Australia, where we had a government which was quite like the Boris Johnson government. I mean, it came from a Conservative party that called itself the Liberal Party, but it went from being a Conservative party under John Howard to being, like Boris Johnson, utterly just sort of running one idiot culture war campaign a day and couldn't do anything. It told us all it was laser focused on getting vaccines and ended up at the back of the queue. And there was evidence that Pfizer had turned up within a couple of weeks to say, do you want early access to this vaccine? That's just one example. But so this was disastrous. And then what happened was, in, I think, 8 or more of the jewels in the crown of the Australian Conservative Party, called the Liberal Party, they lost those seats to independent candidates who were almost to a person extremely accomplished professional women so people were not, the Labor Party was not going to win those seats, and they were called the Teals. And the reason they're called the Teals is that blue is the colour for the Liberals, and they had a green tinge because they were interested in, trying to do the right thing on greenhouse and stuff like that. And so 2 things about the Australian system, well, 3 things, I suppose. One is Australians' sense of their own egalitarian values, often honoured in the breach. But then there were 2 technical aspects of our electoral system, which is compulsory voting, which pushes politicians towards the centre to try and get the votes sitting in the centre, and preferential voting. And what preferential voting, or instant runoff voting. So you could vote for a third candidate who was unlikely to win without losing your vote, as you do in first past the post voting in the United Kingdom. And that meant that you could actually bring about this situation where these people who were running an appallingly bad government, sort of for the Murdoch press, really. I mean, they were talking how the world was being overtaken by trans rights activists and stuff like that. I mean, I happen to kind of agree with them, not that the world's being taken over, but I agree with their point of view. Question, it's just that this was a circus compared with the sorts of things we needed to be talking. And so there are, we still live in open societies, and people can put their case and say we're going down the wrong path. So I think there are lots of green shoots that should be leading us making us somewhat optimistic. And the other thing that makes me optimistic, he said self-servingly, is that if you can work out what's wrong, and that's quite closely connected to something that you could, to doing something in a different way that might improve it, then you just have to start persuading people. And we're in a world where there's a lot of people feeling like they're in a desert and they're pretty desperate to find an oasis. And I'm in the oasis business, and I think that there are some things that we could do. And I think that, if people will give me a go, I'll put the case well, and then they can make up their mind.
Brilliant. Well, great. Let's stick with the oasis business. I like that. And thank you very much, Nicholas. It's been a pleasure talking to you as ever.
Thanks, Henry.